Well, I've had a couple of people recently ask me about my thoughts on what exactly it is that I mean when I talk about sort of the end of the current era in the United States. What exactly I think is going to happen after this current era of craziness with massive deficits, the insane social suicide of wokeness, and the endless wars all come to an end. How does that happen? What exactly triggers that? And the answer is quite simple. What will trigger that is higher interest rates. Interest rates are the most important price in any economy. It is what sort of directs the structure of production in an economy. What the interest rate is set at, or in an ideal sense, where the market sets the interest rate. Although that doesn't happen in our economy, it's set by the Federal Reserve and the central planners. The interest rate plays a very important role in helping entrepreneurs decide what sorts of projects they want to pursue. What they want to invest their time in, and what they want to borrow money to invest in. And I don't want this video to be too long or too dense, so I will skip over most of that and say that, and I can link to other stuff if somebody wants to ask in the comments an explanation of this. But essentially, when the Federal Reserve distorts interest rates, as they've been doing for a very long time, when they pull interest rates down below where they would be set naturally by the forces of supply and demand, you end up with an economic bubble. You get people not only borrowing too much money, but borrowing money and investing it or spending it in ways in which they otherwise would not have done. And so what generally has happened leading up to this current bubble, which began, I guess, around 2010, 2009 is when we, the last recession bottomed out. Normally what the Fed tries to do is lower interest rates so that in the short term they can boost economic growth, but eventually the Fed knows, or at least they used to know, that they will have to raise interest rates in order to rein in all of that malinvestment. In order to essentially pull the rug out from under all the people who made poor decisions, who were, essentially pushed into making those poor decisions by the Fed. But Jerome Powell has made it abundantly clear that as Fed chairman, he has no stomach for any kind of recession. He will never pull the rug out from under all of the people who have borrowed money irresponsibly, or I shouldn't say that, because it's not so much their fault, because they are reacting to what they see to be the market forces, and they're just happen to be acting within a market that is heavily distorted by the Fed. But either way, Powell does not want to purge all of that malinvestment, and it keeps building up and building up. And so in a cyclical bubble economy with a central bank, what you essentially have is a forest that is growing rapidly and has a lot of flaky underbrush kindling, let's say. And when the central bank raises interest rates, it's like a controlled burn. And the reason why you want to hold every few years, you want to hold a controlled burn, is because if you don't keep that stock of underbrush and overgrowth under control, well, then eventually it's going to lead to a situation like they have, every so often over in California, where somebody drops a lit cigarette on the ground and it burns half the state down. And so while a controlled burn, to an onlooker might look like a bad thing, because you go, oh my gosh, look, that part of the forest is on fire, and you've got these trees that are burning. The forest overall is able to weather that storm. They're able to survive and live another day and start growing again. But if you do like California and never have controlled burns, and you just try and always put out the fires, eventually there's going to be a fire that starts that is so extreme because there's so much, there's so much burnable material that just goes up in flames that you're not able to control it, and you end up with an apocalyptic event. That's what we're looking at economically here in the United States. Because Powell will not carry out the controlled burn, which, as Fed chairman, he needs to do, no matter when the time finally comes, this current era will end in disaster. Our economy is so disconnected from underlying fundamentals of reality that once there is a reversion to the mean, we are so far away from the mean that you're going to break a lot of necks. In considering the divisions in America, the way in which people are already at each other's throats, and in which our political system is no longer functioning in a healthy manner, this kind of economic catastrophe, I think, will not be able to weather. And not just because I think that ordinary Americans and things will tear each other apart, and that the politicians will try and burn our society to the ground for short-term gain, to try and blame their political opponents for the catastrophe that we all find ourselves in, because that is a big part of it. If you had a healthy society in which people generally, where all Americans generally considered themselves to be on the same side, you might be able to build enough of a consensus to try and rebuild the economy after that kind of collapse. But even still, beyond the social, the social problems and the problems of social cohesion here in the United States and our political divisions, there is the problem of the federal government's finances itself, and that is that when interest rates finally rise, and I'll get to why they will rise here in a second, when interest rates rise and the economy begins to it loses its artificial stimulus that's pumping it up higher and higher, if it stops receiving those airdrops of fertilizer onto the forest, the federal government will be in as much trouble as the real economy, and that is because the federal government just borrows so much of what it spends. We're now, we're approaching $30 trillion in debt, and the reason why that is not a problem right now is because the interest rate that the federal government is paying is near zero. So the cost of carrying that debt is pretty minuscule relative to how much debt the federal government has accumulated. But of course, if interest rates rise, it's just like an adjustable rate mortgage, because federal debt is largely short term, and so it's constantly being refinanced. So let's say on average the federal government is paying I don't know, 2% a year. I don't know if that's actually the average interest rate of the federal debt, but let's just say it is for argument's sake. They're paying 2%. If that went up from 2% to 3%, well, that's only a 1% increase. I mean, that's nothing. That's not very... Well, it's actually a 50% increase in their carrying costs, because a 1% increase, that's half of 2%. So a 50% increase in the interest expenditures of the federal government every year would severely cripple the feds, and would make it so that they have to borrow even more money in order to continue spending as much as they are. And if the past year and the first quarter this year are any indicator, government spending is all that is keeping the phony economic data that we're receiving sort of in the green. Without everybody receiving their stimmies from Uncle Joe or Uncle Don, as it were, last year, we would not have this so-called booming economy. So if interest rates rise, the federal government will be bankrupt. the federal government would not be able to continue spending the way it is now if we see any rise in interest rates, really. But we will, we're not going to see just a 1 or 2% increase in interest rates. If we do, see sustained higher interest rates, they will keep moving higher from there. Now, at what level the federal government is unable to continue operating, at what point the checks stop getting cashed, at what point, those federal checks start to bounce, that's an open question. But I imagine it'll be at a similar level to that of the rest of the of the regular economy. So the point is that the federal government is going to be unable to bail out the real economy. The only way the federal government was able to bail out the real economy this past year was because the government were the ones shutting down the real economy, and so they just replaced all of that economic activity by printing money. But if the private sector is in distress, not because of lockdowns, but because of higher interest rates, well, the federal government will be in just as much pain and will be just as insolvent. And that's really the shame of the corner that our elites have backed us into. There is no way to control this collapse. We can't deal with one thing at a time. We can't just deal with the private sector and then deal with the financial problems of the federal government. They're all going to come to a head at once. And so as far as so let me, before I move on to what happens after that, interest rates are only going to rise because, as I said, Jerome Powell's not going to raise them himself. Interest rates are only going to rise if the bond market pushes interest rates higher. And the way the only way that the bond market's going to do that is if we have a sustained high inflation. And that's why it's so important to see and to follow this sort of evolving inflation story. The price of lumber is the thing that gets the most headlines because it's one of the most extreme. But overall, prices are clearly rising in this economy, and it's not just about rising standard or rising cost of living. I mean, that's important, but that inflation will affect interest rates because built into any interest rate is an inflation premium. And that is that investors who are loaning money need to make, at the very least, in order to break even, they need to make a rate of interest that is at the level of the rate of inflation. And so the actual interest rate, the real interest rate, is whatever percentage they charge over the rate of inflation. So if you have a loan that with an interest rate of 3% and the inflation rate is 2%, your real interest rate is 1%. Well, if the rate of inflation goes from 2% to 5%, well, in order to maintain that 1% real interest rate, that loan is going to have to, that same loan would be 6%. And so that's what I mean, is that the credit markets, the bond market, if we do see, if they start to price in higher inflation moving forward, and that they stop believing Powell's fantasy about it being transitory, then you're going to see higher interest rates. And when that happens, that's when you really need to be careful and start worrying. Because right now, what you have to watch is the inflation. If inflation does not remain at a high level, if it's not sustained at a high level, this won't be such a big deal. But if it is, then you have to start watching interest rates, and when interest rates get to a certain point, everything breaks. We saw this start to happen back in late 2018 when Jerome Powell actually was raising interest rates, and then we found out he didn't have the stomach for it. Everything was starting to break. We had what did they call it? The Christmas Eve massacre. But there was weakness in markets for months before that. Everyone could see it. It was obvious. This was the end of the business cycle. Jerome Powell was putting it to sleep, and then all of a sudden he had a change of heart. And so ever since then, this has been a ticking time bomb that could go off at any moment. But actually, one last thing I'll add, and this is a bit technical. The reason why sometimes because the Fed prints lots of money all the time, but that doesn't necessarily create high levels of consumer price inflation. the reason why you see that sort of vary, even though the Fed is always printing lots of money, is because of the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. And what that basically means is that when the Fed prints money, who is getting that money? Is it going to bankers? Is it going to rich people? Is it going into the stock market? Is it going somewhere where that money is just going to sit and not be spent at the grocery store, not be spent at the car dealership, not be spent on Amazon? Or is the Fed printing money that's going in the pockets of ordinary people who then go out to the grocery store and buy meat, and who go to Home Depot and buy plywood, and go to the Ford dealership and buy a new truck? When the Fed prints money that goes in the pockets of ordinary people, that's when you get high levels of consumer price inflation. When the Fed prints money that goes into the pockets of rich people, you get a stock market boom. Because what do rich people do with their money? They take it and they invest it. They want to make more money. And so they go out and they buy stocks. And then stocks, get absurd, as they are now. So now for the big question. What will happen when all of this comes to a head, when it becomes clear that the federal government is no longer a viable entity? Well, there's quite a few things that can happen, and that's why this is a terrible scenario that hopefully, if we had real leaders who actually cared about anything, even themselves. I mean, seriously, because if you care about yourself, you don't want this to happen. We would have tried to avoid this. But since this is our fate, we have to explore what the possibilities are. There are two recent historical analogs to America's current situation, and they're both from the 80s, and that is Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. These were two sort of federal systems which had member states, just like the United States, and they both went bankrupt. They both spent themselves into oblivion until there was nothing left for them to spend. And so what happened in these two situations? Well, in the Soviet Union, that is the positive example. That is what hopefully will happen here. The federal system, the Union itself in Moscow was dissolved, and the various member states, the Soviet Socialist Republics, I believe there were, 13 of them, or was it 11? All of the Soviet republics went their separate ways. They're just, they continued to operate, and it's just they got rid of that top layer of the government, and so there was some continuity there. But of course, once the centralized Soviet system was gone, the different republics decided to go their separate ways and reform themselves, and become their own countries. Belarus is probably the one that has stayed the most true to the Soviet system. But it shows there that there was a continuity between the Soviet Union and the new independent republics. There was not a total collapse at all levels of government. It was fairly peaceful. There was, a lot of these republics, unfortunately, were still run by the old communist leaders, but it did not devolve into a bloody civil war. And so it was a huge step in the right direction, but it was by no means led to paradise, as I think most people who lived in the Eastern Bloc or in the former Soviet Union in the 1990s would tell you. It was pretty sketchy time. And of course, you had the oligarchs that came and raided the economic wealth of the various republics. Everything that wasn't bolted down was, ripped up and shipped off for scrap or sold to another country for quite some time. And that did, I think, unquestionably a lot of damage to the former Soviet republics. But things were much worse in Yugoslavia, where they had a similar situation where their federal government became insolvent and ceased to exist. There, they had a race war between the various tribes of Yugoslavia. They had a lot of pent-up anger with one another, because during the time of Tito, you were not allowed to speak of your ethnic identity and such. He tried to keep that under wraps and suppress that, and so that led to a lot of pent-up angst in the various communities. And prior to the breakup of Yugoslavia, the I believe 6 republics, or was it only 5? I can't remember if 6 is including Kosovo or not, but Kosovo was not one of the republics. Anyway, these different republics sort of represented the different nationalities. You had Croatia for the Croats. You had Serbia for the Serbs. You had Montenegro for the Montenegrins, who were pretty close to Serbs, at least in the way things came apart. And you had the Macedonians. They weren't a huge player in the wars, and then Slovenia. Each of these were relatively homogeneous ethno-states, which represented their respective ethnicities. Now, because Yugoslavia was one united country, there were people of different ethnicities who lived outside of their ethnic republic. There were Serbs in Croatia and what was called Slavonia in the time of the Austrians. And Yugoslavia was a fairly small place, so you had people all over who were of different tribal origins. Now, Bosnia, on the other hand, that was sort of the last one that I hadn't mentioned yet, and that is because Bosnia had 3 major ethnic groups, still does. You had the Croats, you had the Bosniaks, or the Bosnian Muslims, and then you had the Serbs. And that's why we saw the most brutal fighting in Bosnia, because after the breakup of Yugoslavia, these various republics wanted to purify themselves and carve out their ethno-states. And so essentially you had the Croats trying to carve out their part of Bosnia, where all the Croats live. You had the Serbs trying to carve out their part of Serbia, and then you had the Bosnian Muslims who really wanted to, from what I understand, they wanted to keep Bosnia a separate country and sort of maintain their not so much dominant role, but at least significant role, because they were, of course, outnumbered by the Serbs and the Croats, I believe. So if Serbia and Croatia cut up Bosnia, there would be a question as to what the role of the Muslims would be, because they would be minorities whether they were under the authority of the Croats or the Serbs. Now, this is a fairly unique situation, or I shouldn't say unique, because there's lots of other places that have similar problems and could have turned into Yugoslavia. But I don't think that this sort of scenario is going to play out in the United States, because we do not have overtly ethnic republics like Yugoslavia. And that's just not really what the nature of our divisions are over here. Yes, you have a lot of race baiting, because that's an easy way to try and divide people. But because we have, still have a strong white majority throughout the vast majority of the United States, and there is nowhere really a strong majority of, any other racial or ethnic group, I don't think that we would see a war that has the same sort of connotations as Yugoslavia if there was a collapse of the United States at the federal level. I do, however, think that there is a big problem of tribalism in the United States that could lead to violence, but it is sort of over the political tribes. Not really ideological, because people in the United States are not ideological, at least 99% of people I've ever met are not ideological, but they are tribal in the sense that they sort of identify culturally with the left or the right. And so if there were to be fighting in the case of a breakup of the United States, it would be it would be political minorities within certain states trying to separate and perhaps join another like-minded state. Similar to what we've seen since 2014 in the Donbass in Ukraine, where you have some people who are more closely aligned with Russia, although this is for ethnic reasons. But again, tribal identity is very much like ethnicity, even though here, our tribal identities are political and not racial. It from sort of I think from a psychological standpoint, they're almost identical. So Ukraine, you have these guys who don't like the government in Kiev, and they say, no, we'd rather be ruled by Moscow. And so you could see something like, let's say in Oregon, for example, where the counties outside of Portland say, you know what, no, we don't want to be subject and ruled by Portland. We want to be ruled by Idaho. But other than that, there's really no reason to fight in the United States. The conflict in the United States comes from having this joint unified central government that we all have to share, despite having different views and different life experiences and different values. And so if that goes away, within a few years, the divisions in the United States that you see now would disappear and would be, I think that the various states that the Union would turn into pretty happy neighbors. And in fact, a lot of them, I think, would join up and probably form new unions. So we don't need to burn it all down in America. We just need to restructure things so that our modern political system is a little more reflective of current reality. But of course, if we still had the system that was set up in 1791 or 1789, whenever they came up with the Constitution, and I know it's a cliche, but we wouldn't have these problems because the original federal government was supposed to be very limited in scope anyway, because the founders understood even back then, when there were so much fewer states and such a smaller population, that you couldn't force all those people to agree on everything. And so, at the end of all this, and I'm trying to be optimistic here, I think that the United States, or what the former United States, America, will be much better off. And it will be much closer to the vision of the Founding Fathers in that sense. Political power will be much more localized, and states will be able to properly differentiate themselves from each other and, assert their own values. And that's why I've said for many, many years, we need to rip this Band-Aid off. We need to get it over with, and pursue higher interest rates. Because the collapse at this point is baked into the cake, and so therefore the longer we wait, it's just going to get worse and worse, ultimately. In closing, there are very, very dark days ahead, but I'm still trying to remain optimistic that ultimately it will result in a net improvement, because from every angle, economically, socially, the current state of affairs is totally unsustainable, and I don't think anybody wants it to stick around. So with that said, I will end things here for today.